And we start with NATO's latest efforts to support Ukraine. Alliance Chief Marke Rutte says a majority of states have agreed to provide nearly €3.5 billion in new aid, saying that NATO can't falter in its commitment to Kyiv. A meeting in Brussels, Alliance foreign ministers agreed to purchase of vital US-made equipment, including air defence systems. Now, the gathering comes after US and Russian delegations meeting in Moscow failed to make any breakthrough in efforts to stop the war. Well, as NATO promises to spend billions on buying more US arms for Ukraine, the European Union says it's planning to use frozen Russian assets to support Kyiv. European leaders believe unlocking the assets would send a message of solidarity, but also make it clear to Moscow that continuing its war against Ukraine would be costly.
Allies assure Ukraine that even though peace negotiations seem to be going nowhere, neither is NATO.
Putin believes he can outlast us, but we are not going anywhere. Today is yet another clear sign that he is wrong. We are strengthening our support for Ukraine and increasing pressure on Russia.
Meanwhile, across town from NATO headquarters, the European Commission unveiled a long-awaited proposal to make Russia pay for the damage it's doing to Ukraine.
We would use the cash balances from the mobilized Russian assets in the European Union. We're providing them to Ukraine as a loan, and Ukraine has to pay back this loan if and when Russia is paying reparations.
Von der Leyen proposes using €90 billion of immobilized Russian money in this way, which she says, when added to other international contributions, would finance Ukraine for 2 years. This is a popular option with many European governments.
We do believe that this is the only viable option.
Exactly the opposite view from Belgium, where most of the Russian assets are held.
We consider the option of the reparations loan the worst of all.
Belgian Foreign Minister Maxime Prévost says the EU Commission's proposal does not address his government's fear Moscow could reclaim the cash, all billed to Belgium.
It is not acceptable to use the money and leave us alone facing the risks. We demand that the risks Belgium is facing as a result of this scheme are fully covered.
And since the matter of using the frozen assets is not technically a NATO issue, the fact it was widely discussed, at least in the margins of the ministerial, shows just how significant it is.
The frozen assets is a potential game changer.
But first, the Belgian mind needs to be changed.
We're willing to provide the Belgians with some assurance that they won't be left alone if something like that occurs. But in what form or shape, we'll have to see over the coming weeks.
They've only got 2. Von der Leyen has pledged to have this tricky issue settled by the next EU summit on December 18th.
Let's get more from Teri Schultz, who's at NATO headquarters. Welcome, Teri. So billions to be purchased by NATO members from the United States. Is that the future of military support for Ukraine?
Yes, Phil, this is a really important program for NATO. It was devised over the summer by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and the Trump administration. And in this scheme, the European countries pay for U.S. weapons. Now, this is one way to keep the Americans engaged, to ensure that Ukraine gets the top quality equipment that it needs. And it fulfills what President Trump has always said is the need for Europeans to spend more on their own defense, as well as to be the primary supporters of Ukraine. So this PEARL, Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, is really where NATO is putting its focus now. And as Secretary General Rutte said, today Germany, Poland and Norway stepped up with one more $500 million package. Norway is giving money to another package that the Netherlands is contributing to. So really, allies are currently putting their assets together in these $500 million tranches to get the top quality weapons that Ukraine is asking for.
And at this meeting of NATO foreign ministers happening just a day after US and Russian negotiators made no apparent progress on a peace plan for Ukraine, how much did yesterday's Moscow meeting affect today's meetings in Brussels?
You could definitely feel it, and almost all of the ministers arriving here today talked about this, talked about both their support for the Trump administration trying to bring Russia to the table and make some concessions, but also their skepticism that the Kremlin has any intention whatsoever of stopping its full-scale war on Ukraine. So I don't think most of these frontline states in particular were surprised to hear that Russian President Vladimir Putin had shown absolutely no sign that he wanted to stop the war. But this is also why you heard Rutte say that NATO needs to reinforce its own security as well as continue its steadfast support for Ukraine, very much feeling that this war is by no means at its end.
And a brief word about the European Union presenting its latest plan to use frozen Russian assets for Ukraine. There is still resistance. How's that debate unfolding?
Yeah, this is what many leaders are calling a game changer if they can get it through. The European Commission is trying to reassure Belgium, where most of these assets are currently held, that it would not be responsible if Russia was able to come back and reclaim this money. So the European Commission today laid out its legal basis for using 90 billion euros as collateral and loaning that money to Ukraine. Now, if Russia comes back and pays Ukraine for the damage, then Kyiv would repay the loan. Now, it is a very complex legal process, and the Belgian foreign minister arriving here at NATO this morning said he'd read the deal and it was still a no-go for Belgium. So this debate will clearly go on, Phil.
Thanks, Teri. Teri Schultz at NATO headquarters in Brussels.
We're very pleased to have with us the Dutch Foreign Minister and former NATO Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, David van Weel. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Minister. So today is potentially a day where we could see movement finally, at least from the European Union side, on the Russian frozen assets, with the European Commission announcing its plan at this very moment, as a matter of fact, on how they would propose to reassure Belgium that they would be covered in case Russia comes back. Does the Netherlands feel that the Commission's plan, if you've been able to take a look at it, is enough? Belgium already told us this morning it's not satisfactory. What's the Dutch view?
Well, we haven't been able to study the plan in detail, but we will look at it with interest. We do believe that this is the only viable option. We agree there with the Commission. Now we'll have to look at the details. We have a few more weeks. The European Council, half December, will have to take a decision. But on the
Two
other
and a
hand,
half, anyway.
on the other hand, that's not too far away, so we need to speed up the process.
What do you mean it's your only plan? Because what the Belgians are saying is, borrow money on the markets. The European Commission has the leverage to do this. They feel that there are better options than using this money. But is that a very Belgian-centric view in your?
Well, we understand the Belgian concerns, and we need to appease them and give them a peace of mind on how collectively we are going to help them in shouldering any burdens that might come forward. But we still believe that this is the most viable option and that we need to work towards that.
So Bart de Wever says that they have asked countries to sign up for a specific amount of money that they would be responsible for should the Russians get to reclaim the money. Is the Netherlands willing to sign up to a specific sum?
Well, we'll see in the next few weeks where we end up. We're willing to provide the Belgians with some assurance that they won't be left alone if something like that occurs. But in what form or shape, we'll have to see over the coming weeks.
But I can understand why that doesn't sound so convincing. Some assurance that they won't be left alone doesn't sound like an ironclad guarantee like they feel they need.
Well, I'm not going to give you the end state of where we will end up. I first have to study the proposal, then look at what that would entail and how we can assure the Belgians to come on board as well.
So other priorities here today, some of which you're very, very familiar with, hybrid threats, for example. That used to be one of your specialties here. Do you think there's any consensus that NATO as an alliance needs to take a more aggressive view, as was stated by the CMC? This is not something that really happens in practice now during peacetime. Is there any change on that?
Well, the best defense against hybrid attacks is to have a proper defense. NATO is a defensive alliance, so we will not see any aggression coming out of NATO unprovoked or preemptively. But what we need to do is to ensure that we are guarded against disinformation, that we share information on drone sightings among nations, that we are able to do attribution, like in the case of the Polish railway sabotage. That will allow us for having stronger messaging, better defense, and therefore hopefully countering this hybrid threat.
So you said we will not see NATO take preemptive action. as the CMC was suggesting?
Well, we will not take any preemptive military action that's not within the mandate of NATO. What we should do is defend ourselves and prepare ourselves and react when we are attacked.
What about things like cyber actions? Are those military actions?
Well, cyber is a very hybrid beast also within NATO. So there is a common cyber response, there's attribution, etc. And then there's sovereign nations that are able to take decisive actions in cyberspace. Most of that happens outside of the NATO mandate.
So final question. The Netherlands is among the countries that has spent a lot of money on Ukraine by GDP and signed up to Pearl, and there are a lot of countries which are not contributing anything yet. So what are countries like you and the Nordics doing to convince the other allies that they also need to contribute to this program or some other way assistance to Ukraine?
Well, first of all, we're showing the right example. So also today we announced another 250 million euros coming out of the Netherlands into a Pearl package together with Norway and Germany. I think we are the countries among the highest contributors net, but also relatively to Ukraine. We're also trying to convince other nations they need to be part of this. And we've heard today during the meeting that the number of nations signing up to Pearl packages has risen. It was around 20, I believe, before we started the meeting. And I think we ended, but I just left before the end. It might become higher, around 24 or 25.
So some of those which were not contributing before?
Absolutely. So slowly, I think we're getting to a more fairer burden sharing. But that needs to continue, not only now, but also in the next year, because Ukraine will continue to need our support.
And Secretary General said it may more than double next year, the need to be purchased through Pearl, right?
Absolutely, and the Pearl packages are what actually helps Ukraine right now. I mean, it's the munition they need, it's the air defense they need, it's the munition for the F-16s that they need. So it provides with real capabilities. Countries can trace it back. So it's a transparent package. We know that it goes to good use and it saves civilians' lives.
All right. Thank you very much, Dutch Foreign Minister David van Weel.